I made over $100,000 in 6 months from wholesaling real estate and then gave it up nearly just as quickly as I got started with it. And I first learned about wholesaling on YouTube because as somebody who has never been in real estate, some of you watching may be able to relate to that. I had never been in real estate and I was over here, right? As somebody that was like, what the heck is going on? That's where I was starting with. And then on YouTube, I'm finding these people over here, right? The Grant Cardones of the world, the gurus, all these people that are like, oh, I'm worth $100 million or whatever it might be. And I'm like, how do I bridge this gap between me as somebody who knows nothing about real estate and this person over here, Grant Cardone, and those types of people that are buying these apartment buildings and worth hundreds of millions of dollars? Like, what is that gap? And there was so many kind of stops on the way, right? There's things like becoming a real estate agent, becoming a real estate investor. But all of those things that I was finding on YouTube, there was one thing that tied them all together. Money. It was money. All of those people and all of those things required you to have money or some sort of a license, right? You go become a real estate agent, you form these relationships, you take forever, and eventually you start making money. And so I saw these opportunities here and I knew, okay, that might be the direction I want to go, but how do I get from where I am now to where I want to be going? And it wasn't any of those things. It was figuring out how can I get started from zero and make money right away, in theory, right? I obviously wanted to make money as quickly as possible. You may be able to relate to that because who the heck doesn't? And so what I found on YouTube was wholesale. And at the time, the only time I had heard the word wholesale was when we were talking about Costco food. So I didn't exactly know what the heck that meant. But as I started diving into the deep sea of YouTube, I was finding that wholesale, it was actually fundamentally pretty simple. You take a house, you buy it for $100,000, and it's all, broken down, whatever, on the side of the road. And then we take that house and we find somebody that's willing to buy it for $150,000. And then I would profit 50 grand. Now, at the time, 50 grand was more money than I had seen in my life. And obviously hypotheticals were the enemy of my success because me showing you these numbers and actually executing on it is a completely different story. So how did I get from here to making $100,000 and then quitting and shutting that entire operation down? Like, what the heck did that look like? Well, again, starting with YouTube, I figured out, okay, this fundamental of wholesaling is finding properties that people can't sell. That is the basis of wholesaling. It's simply finding properties that the sellers, the agents, whoever it is, can't sell. And that could be because the property is beaten down and it needs to get flipped, or more specifically, in my case, it was finding properties that couldn't sell traditionally. This was a couple of years ago as of the time of recording this. And at the time, rates were going up and houses were getting harder to sell. And so that was where creative finance was really starting to thrive. Because what I was doing and what I was starting to read books about and research and listen to podcasts about was buying real estate properties creatively. For example, seller financing, taking properties subject to, and a bunch of other kind of niches within that realm. And so I said, okay, this seems like a great way to go wholesale properties. Now I need to find somebody that's actually doing it. And so my next step was finding people, and this is one of the biggest things that I think people miss when they're getting started, finding people that were actually having success doing this strategy with something that I felt like I could do too. Now, there's a lot of different kinds of wholesale. There's wholesale where you go out and you spend a bunch of money every month on leads and all of this kind of high tech stuff. But remember, I was at square zero. Like I was not about to go spend money on anything. I didn't even turn on the AC in my car when I lived in Florida because I wanted to save money. So I was not about to go spend money on this stuff. So I had to figure out, okay, how can I get into this for cheap and do something that I actually feel like is tangible? And so I started finding people that were having success, and what they were doing was they would get on the phone and they would call real estate agents. And when they were on the phone with these real estate agents, they would say, hey, I see that you are having trouble selling your house. Would your client or would you be interested in entertaining some sort of a creative offer? Now, this was met with a lot of rejection and frustration from those real estate agents, but nonetheless, it was how I was getting started with this process. And I did that for months. And throughout those months, I tried many different things. I tried the traditional wholesale routes. I took some detours into some other things, and I kind of ended up back where I started, shocker, back in the wholesaling realm, because I just realized that there's so many things that I can't get into in real estate without experience or without money or without actual relationships. And I didn't know anybody in real estate, so I didn't know what the heck else to do other than what I found to be the simplest way to get started, with wholesaling. And so I was calling agents every day, trying to convince them to sell their property to us. And finally, 6 months later, I was able to get my first property under contract. Boom. This is my first property. This was in Denver, Colorado. And I've been working on this property for months. I had been talking to the agent, trying to get the sellers to work with us. And finally, I was able to get this property under contract. But of course, getting a property under contract and actually closing on it is not the same thing, which is one of the things that we will discuss further. Because when I got this property under contract, between that and closing, there's still going to be about 30 to 45 days. And in that time is chaos. That's where everything can go wrong. Because as a wholesaler, the first thing that we have to be able to do is find a buyer. We had to be able to find somebody that actually wanted to buy this property. And one of the hardest parts about that, especially now, is that a lot of these properties weren't great investments, which means that most people didn't want to buy them. And that, of course, made it very difficult to get this done. So we were working on that. I was trying to find a buyer. This is my first property, so I'm trying to act like I know what I'm doing, even though I probably don't. And finally, we find a buyer, and I kid you not, crazy enough, we found a buyer that at the end of the day is going to make me $20,000. Again, I have never made money outside of a traditional job at this point. My entire salary is about to get half of that is about to come in on one deal. Greatest moment of my life, right? If everything just goes according to plan, then everything will be perfect. And of course, it did not, because as we went along, we had buyers fall through, which meant that disappeared. This went from 30 to 45 days to more like 60, and everything was, not going very well, right? Lots of issues with this deal, which is, of course, what wholesaling is. And so throughout this process, we had to go find new buyers. We had to get new fees, right? All of this stuff. And finally, when we get to the end of this deal, I ended up making $2,198. So almost $18,000 less than I had originally planned. However, I was able to get my first deal. Now I've got a lot of stories to talk about with this deal, because this deal, my first ever deal, and I did probably 25 or 30 of these deals, but my first deal ended up teaching me the lesson that led to me shutting down this $100,000 business in 6 months. And it's a lesson that I think will impact every single one of you watching this, because it has completely transformed my life. So when we're talking about wholesaling, right? When we're talking about going and finding these properties and reselling them, which no matter what method of wholesaling you're doing, it's all going to fall under that realm. It could be wholesaling properties where you're working directly with sellers, working with agents, working with brokers. The list goes on, but the fundamentals stay the same. Some people spend money, some people don't. But either way, what are the pros of wholesaling? Because if I made $100,000 doing it, then there darn well is some pros that we can talk about. So let's talk about the pros of wholesaling. Because obviously, if I can make $100,000 doing it, then there's got to be some positives to this stuff, right? Even if I shut this business down, what are the pros if you're looking to get into it? Well, the first thing is that anyone can do it. This was one of the biggest things that obviously allowed me to get started in the first place, right? There's a lot of things that require licenses, that require money, that require a ton of time. But you and anyone else, including a 10-year-old kid, can go sit down on their computer right now, type in Zillow.com or Realtor.com or whatever it might be, and find properties and wholesale them. Now, can you do that on your own? No, but it's insane how many resources we all have access to as a part of the world that we live in now, right? You can go on a Facebook group or a school group or whatever it might be, a local meetup, and even starting from zero like I did, anybody can do this stuff. And that can't be understated. That is so crucial out of all of the things that, require so much upfront capital, like drop shipping or trading stocks or any of these things that are way, way higher level. This is something where you can just try it out. Go on there, worst thing, nothing happens, right? But anybody can do it, and that is huge. The second thing is that you can make money fast. Again, as somebody coming from a background of only working in W-2, which I think is pretty relevant to a lot of people, this is a massive, massive change to be able to say, hey, I make $10 an hour, $15, $20 an hour, right? Whatever it is you're making. All of a sudden you can say, with one right move, I could make 10 grand, 20 grand. I know people who have made $250,000 off of one good deal. Now, Do those deals just come every day? No, they're way harder to find. But the fact that you can make money that fast and there's really no real cap as to what kinds of deals you can make money on, it's like a blessing and a curse, right? But since we're talking about pros, that is a huge pro, that you right now can make the same amount of money that you make in a year off of one deal if you take the right action, you're consistent, and maybe get a little bit of luck along the way. But either way, huge that you can just make money that fast. And then the third one that I really want to hit on is that you don't have to be an expert. I want to talk about this, right? Because when you're looking at this, there are so many things where you can't make mistakes, right? There's so many things where you can't go out, you can't do something unless you're fully trained, unless you have, every avenue covered, unless you have a ton of experience, unless you have the relationships, whatever it might be. But in wholesaling, you don't have to be an expert, because if you go and search for houses and you can't figure anything out, cool. It has no effect on anybody or you whatsoever. If you go and get a property under contract that you probably shouldn't have gotten under contract because it wasn't a good deal, well, as long as you play your cards right, the worst thing that happens is that you could lose EMD. But if you do it correctly, you won't even lose your EMD. And so there's really no downsides. Anybody can go try this, and if you mess it up, you're not going to get hurt and you're not going to hurt other people. You're just going to learn how the process works. And for somebody starting at zero like I was, this was actually a really big green flag for me, that I could just go try it out and see what happens. So that's some of our pros about wholesaling. Now, if I was running a $100,000 business, or we made over $130,000 in 5 months with this business, right? If I was doing that and it got shut down, then there must be some cons. So let's talk about a couple cons. All right. Con number one is that deals die without control. This is a big one. So when I had that first deal that I was just talking about, right? I spent months on the phones with these people. I did everything right. I got the contract signed. I covered everything that I knew how to cover. But then the deal fell apart. Why? Because the buyer changed their mind. Because things happen with the property. There's all these details with liens and all of this stuff coming up. And so all of a sudden, even though I've done everything right, the deal starts falling apart around me. And a little disclaimer, you think that's the only time that happened to me? No, obviously not. Deals die all of the time by no fault of your own, right? There's no control that I had over those things going south. So I was now losing money, just like the pro of being able to make infinite money. Well, I'm now losing money without anything that I've done. That doesn't happen at your job, right? If you do the work, if you show up to work, you get paid every hour regardless. But here, you can do all the right things and have your deals die, and that, I must admit, is brutal. Number two, wholesaling is what I would describe as dog eat dog. Nobody is really out to help you because everybody is trying to get the same properties. They're trying to make the same money, and the more money you make, the less money they make. Now, is that always true? No, but that's the mentality that people seem to approach wholesaling with, is that if you get it, I don't. And so everybody is calling the same lists, right, for properties. They're calling the same list. They're going to the same auctions. They're talking to the same agents, and it makes it really, really difficult to level up because everybody's kind of fighting at this like pretty low level. It's not like you're making millions of dollars or anything like that. So everybody's just kind of scratching and clawing, trying to pay their bills, trying to get that next success because it's really hard to figure out. And so that's number two. And then number three, this is something that changed my life. This thing right here. If you leave this video after this, you will have gotten the main point that has changed everything about everything for me. And that's that wholesaling shows up as a hamster wheel. Let's show you what it looks like. So we've got a property right here. And when we get this property, we're going to take that property and we are going to get it under contract. And then we're going to go over here and we're going to find a buyer. And if everything goes well, that completes the cycle, right? We get a property under contract, we find a buyer, and in theory, we get paid. And it looks exactly like this. And think about your neighborhood that you live in right now, right? Let's say there's a property on the corner. It's all messed up. It needs to be fixed up and flipped. That's this property right here. Once we go under contract, the buyer buys that property, and if everything goes well, which is already hard to get to, we get to the end of this, that is the end of the cycle, okay? And that's what I really want to emphasize with wholesaling in general, is that when I was going through this, right, and I realized this happens one time, I finished that first deal, right, made $2,198, I'll even pop up the statement from when I closed that deal. It was $2,198 that I made on that deal. When I closed that deal, it was this moment of like, I was supposed to make way more money, but still instant relief that I closed the deal. And then guess what happened after that? I had to restart. I had to go back to zero. When you're at work and you get paid on Friday, guess what happens the next week or 2 weeks, depending on how your paychecks work? You get paid again. But in wholesaling, what I learned really quickly, very painfully on these properties, was that when I closed the deal, I had to then go restart and go find another deal to try and make more money, where I could then run into the same thing with the deals falling apart and everybody's fighting me and all of this other stuff. And this isn't really a profound understanding unless we can make the claim of, okay, if there is something that only happens once and then it restarts, then how do we find something that doesn't do that? And one of the concepts that I want to hit on here, that really, when people talk about this term passive income, which is like a term I hate more than anything else. When people talk about passive income, because by the way, in case nobody's told you this, there's no such thing as passive income. Everything that you do requires work. What are people really saying? Well, what they're saying is that in your job, if you make on month 1, if you make 10 grand, then on month 2, you are also going to make 10 grand, right? Because that's just your paychecks. If you are leaving a traditional job and starting a business, what creates financial freedom? What creates this, quote, passive income? Well, it's when you can replicate this in your own business. And there's a couple ways to do that. One of the things that you'll hear people talk about is recurring revenue. Another one that you'll hear is reoccurring. Not the same word, revenue. Okay? These are the two things that create this passive income effect, this recycled effect. Because what we're looking at here with these two things is, okay, we've got our recurring revenue. That's if somebody is paying you the same amount every month. For example, if you signed a client to your business that paid you $3,000 a month, that's recurring revenue, right? Reoccurring revenue is when it's not every month, but the person keeps coming back. And this is what I want to touch on. For example, if you think about someone like Coca-Cola, you don't go out and buy one Coke and then never buy Coke again. Now, do you pay Coke a subscription to get that delivered every month? Probably not, although some of you weirdos might, but for the most part, probably not. But you're going to go back to the store and maybe buy it again next week or next month or whatever it might be. And so you are going to rebuy that again and again, meaning that you as the customer are going to pay Coke multiple repeating times. It's not recurring, but it's reoccurring. It's happening over and over again. Hold on to that, because that is what we're going to get into next, because that concept is the reason why I shut this thing down. But let's talk about the real story. What happened here? We're going back to the original house, right? This original wholesale deal, we'll call it wholesale number 1. Now again, keep in mind, I ended up wholesaling 25, 30 properties, but this wholesale number 1, this was the game changer, because here I am selling this property to a buyer. This is me. I'm profiting my $2,198. Now, throughout that process, we had the deal fall apart. It was miserable. We were supposed to make 20 grand. We end up at the end and we make 21.98. And here's what I want to show you. If you don't know a HUD statement, which is what I popped up earlier, a HUD statement is what shows you where all of the money goes on a real estate purchase. Okay. And so on this HUD statement, right here, it said Ryan is going to get 21.98. All right. Cool. I worked my butt off. I'm finally at least making some money. It's better than nothing. And then right below that, I see this other person that's making $2,000. And I said, hold up. Who is this person that's making the same amount of money as me? And did they work as hard as I did? Because I spent months on this property. I have had sleepless nights trying to get to this $21.98. What did this person do? Can you guess what this person did? Did they cold call people? Did they work with the contracts? Did they deal with the buyers? Did they get yelled at on the phone for months at a time? No. What this person did was they funded the EMD. For this deal right here, the buyer came and brought me $5,000 in EMD. And what that did was that was them saying, hey, Ryan, we're serious about buying this property. We'll give you $5,000 to hold on to that property until we purchase it, right? That's their soft deposit, their payment, whatever you want to call it. But the buyer didn't bring that money. They had this other person bring this $5,000 for them, right? This was their funder. That person brought the money for them. And so we get to the end of this deal. And this person right here, I see them on the HUD statement making the same amount of money as me for doing one millionth of the amount of work that I had done. And on my first deal, I said, I want to do what that person just did. How do I do that? How do I figure that out? Because I'm on this wholesale thing, but that person just made the same amount of money, and that is blowing my mind. And that was my introduction to what now has changed my life. And it's right here. Transactional funding. At that moment, I saw somebody making the same amount of money as me for doing one millionth of the amount of work. And I said, I want to figure that out. Now, remember, when I started this, why did I get into wholesaling? Because I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have any experience and I didn't want to put any money into things. So when I see this person putting money into the deal, the first thought is like, how can I do that? But also, I don't have the money to do that. So can I still get into this? So then I did what any person would do that really wants to figure this out, I guess. And I talked to the person who funded that deal and I said, how did you do that? And they said, oh, well, I found the opportunity and then I just had somebody else bring the funds, the $5,000, and then we split the profit. And then I'm like, what the heck is going on? So you're telling me that you funded that deal. It took you 30 seconds. You had somebody else bring the money and you made the same amount of money as I did on this transaction. You have to be freaking kidding me. That was my introduction to transactional funding, because here's the main change that you'll see. And this is what I was noticing with these people, right? Here's our wholesale hamster wheel. We're going under contract, we're getting a buyer, and then that's happening one time. And that's it. So we're going under contract, we find a buyer, that happens one time, and then that cycle is done. And that was the misery that I was living with in the wholesale world because I kept restarting. So then I talked to this person who's funding the deals and they said, oh yeah, so what happens is they fund the EMD on this deal, they get paid, and then that cycle just repeats over and over. Well, why is that? Because this house, this property, was being replaced with an investor. Now, when you go buy one property, that property is gone, right? But if you're an investor and you go buy one property, what do you do after you buy that property? You go buy another, right? You do another fix and flip. You buy another rental. You wholesale another deal. Whatever it might be, the investor goes out and does that work. Now, somebody's got to do the work, but if we're going to follow the process of work smarter, not harder, and somebody is already going out and doing that work, then why would I not try and figure out something that instead of doing it one time, I can find this investor right here. And this investor, I can just repeat the cycle over and over and over with the same one person instead of having to go every single time. That was the life-altering thing that I figured out about transactional funding. And that was why I said, get me into this. Now, that was on my first ever wholesale deal and I ended up doing 30. So what the heck, Ryan? Why didn't you jump into it sooner? Well, I didn't have anybody to help me figure it out. So it took me a long time. Okay. Sorry. I saw somebody do it. I started talking to them. I said, how do I get into this stuff? But there was a lot more hurdles that I had to jump through to learn the process. Because first of all, I was learning about this EMD funding stuff, right? I saw somebody funding the EMD and I was like, cool, is that the whole thing? And they were like, no, not even close. There's so many different types of transactional funding. And as I went throughout that, I got into double closing. I got into seller carrybacks. I got into funding escrow. I was learning about all of these different things, right? All of these different things with transactional funding. And one of the biggest things I learned was that all of these things only required contracts. Now, why do I bring that up? Because there's a lot of things that would fall under the realm of lending, right? And lending would be if I was going out and I was putting money down on a property and then that money was protected by the property itself. That's things like the mortgage you have on your house or the loan that somebody gets for a fix and flip or anything like that. But this transactional funding was different, because it wasn't protected by the asset, by the house. It was protected by escrow. It was protected by the contracts that I was using. So it was a completely different thing. And so I dove in learning this on the side while continuing to wholesale. And I did that for months before I realized something crazy. And what I realized was that I was spending 95% of my time on wholesale and 5% of my time on funding. And both of these things were making the same amount of money. Shocking for me that I was spending 5% of my time on something that was making me the same amount of money that was 95% of my time, but also this was contributing to 100% of my stress because wholesaling was painful. I had deals falling through. I had people yelling at me. I had people fighting over things. There was all of these different things that I was dealing with. And I said, oh my gosh, how the heck am I still doing the thing that's causing me all of these problems instead of just focusing on this thing that's going to relieve all of that and allow me to get into things? And so let's talk about transactional funding, not just the pros, but both sides, just like we talked about wholesaling, with the goal of you being able to compare those two things and figure out for yourself which of these is going to make the most sense to help me make money the quickest. Let's talk about the pros. Pro number one, I've already kind of covered, and it was that crazy realization I had that it was simply less work. It's really that simple. Now, I'm not saying that it is no work, and I am not saying that it is easy, but what I am saying is that if you look at a deal, right? Let's take a common real estate deal. And you could look at this from the perspective of a wholesaler, an investor, whatever you want. Let's say we're doing wholesaler versus funder. On the wholesale side, we have cold call, we have contracts, or negotiate, we have finding a buyer, we have EMD, we have transaction coordinators, we have the title company that we have to deal with, we have the statements, we have things that can come up with the property like liens or other issues. We have the real estate agents that we have to deal with. And I'm going to stop there, even though I could keep going because I feel like I've filled up the space. On any given deal, that's what a wholesaler is dealing with. Now, on that deal that I dealt with the funder, what did they have to deal with? Well, they funded and they signed and filled out their own contracts. And that was it. And purely from a volume perspective, I think you can see this clear comparison on why I am saying it was way less work for me to figure this stuff out. That's it. It was way less work because I didn't have to go crazy trying to get all of that stuff done. And that is an absolute game changer. So that was the pro that kind of drew me in to begin with, right? That was the thing that I was like, wait, this is awesome. Okay. Now that was just the beginning because number two is where things really started to make a shift for me. And that was that there was leverage, and leverage changed everything for me. Here's what I mean. Really, I guess I should keep this comparison up the whole time, huh? So I'll do wholesale versus funding. So let's talk about the leverage side of things, right? If we're looking at this, switch to blue. So we're looking at the difference between these two things when it comes to leverage, okay? If you do one cold call and you find somebody, that can lead to one deal, right? But on the funding side, if you find one investor, like I talked about, that can lead to infinite deals. But that leverage is only the beginning, because if you're looking at this, right? One deal versus infinite deals, that's where we go from one-time revenue to reoccurring revenue, which already is life-changing, changed my life when I understood this. But what about the leverage with the money itself? Well, if you get a deal, a wholesale deal, right? You're going to make your profit is going to be based off of whatever the buyer agrees to. AKA, it's based off of the deal itself. So if you have a crappy deal, you might make $1,000. If you have a really good deal, you might make $10,000 or $15,000 or whatever that number becomes, but it's based off of the buyer's agreement. Well, over here, the money that you make is based off of the amount needed. And that right there is what I mean when I talk about this leverage. So look at this. If we fund a $10,000 deal, then we might make a $1,000 profit. But if we fund a $1 million deal, making 10%, then we make a $100,000 profit. No matter which of those things we do, the work that I do stays the same. We fill out the contracts and we fund the deal. That's it. But we can make infinite levels more money. And what that really meant, one of the biggest lessons that I learned getting into this, was that I didn't have to fund these small deals because every single one took so much work, and I could just start focusing on bigger deals. And I said a year ago on this channel, I said that I was going to start doing more of that. And that's exactly what I've done. I've started focusing on these bigger deals so that instead of making $1,000, I make $10,000 or $20,000 or $50,000 on these deals. And then we can only do a few deals a month and you can still be making hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that's the second thing, right? In our comparison is simply the leverage that you have on these properties. Now, I want to pull up real quick the third thing because this is what's going to really kind of get us into the last part of this. And that's that we are having, with that leverage, switch back to the black. We'll call it compound growth. We're having compound growth. Now, this all goes back to that wholesale hamster wheel. This goes back to the things that changed my life. Because when I talk about compound growth, let's go back to our comparison chart. If on month 1, right, let's do it this way, month 1, month 2, month 3. So on month 1, if I get one wholesale deal, let's say for easy math, I make 10 grand, right? Now I have to restart from scratch. On month 2, I get one wholesale deal and I make 10 grand. Then I start from scratch. And then on month 3, I get one wholesale deal and I make 10 grand. Okay? That is just straight flatline growth. Well, really no growth at all, right? It's me restarting to try and get one deal to make the same amount of money I did last month. Now, in comparison with funding on month 1, if I made 10 grand, I now have this repeat borrower, right? This investor that's coming back to me the next month with their next deal or their next deals. And so I am seeing, and this is literally fundamentally how my business was built. I was seeing that this person that made me 10 grand the month before was going to come back and they were going to make me another 10 grand the next month. But since I've already found that person that's going to make me this 10 grand, what am I going to do in the meantime? Well, I'm going to go out and find another investor. And when I find that other investor, they're going to make me another 10 grand. And so now in month 2, I have 2 investors coming to me. And then in month 3, I've got what? The 10 grand coming back from the first investor, the 10 grand coming back from the second investor. And now I go out and find a third investor. And so if you look at this timeline, I made 10K every month here, restarting from scratch. But here, I'm compounding that growth every single month. And if I show you a timeline over the last year of my transactional funding business, you'll see that I'm not making 10K a month. I made 5K my first month, and then 10K, and then 20, and then 30, and then 50, and then 100, and then 150. And it keeps compounding because these numbers just keep going up. The same people come back while new people come in. And that is the third pro, and one of the craziest parts that all goes back to that initial statement about the wholesale hamster wheel. That's what it all goes back to, because that's when I realized that there is a better way, a smarter way to get this done. Now, does that mean it's all sunshines and rainbows? No. And people always say, do you talk about the bad stuff? All the time I talk about the bad stuff. Let's talk about the cons of transactional funding. Number 1, deals die. It's the same as wholesaling. Because guess what? It's real estate. And if you are working in real estate, your deals are going to die. Why? Because real estate involves multiple parties. It involves sellers that change their mind all the time. It involves money. It involves lenders. And if the wholesaler has the deal falling through, you as the funder can still be in that same position, which means that you can still have the deal fall through. Major con of transactional funding. And maybe if I'm comparing these two things, I could also say that's just a con of real estate. You're not always going to have control over these things. Now, if we compare this con to the pros of transactional funding versus wholesaling, you realize what? What was the first pro that I talked about for transactional funding? It's way less work. So what does that mean? If this deal dies, which by the way, I have deals die all the time, right? When I have a deal die, I usually up to that point have funded the deal and signed contracts. And so if the deal dies, then I just get my money sent back and then I'm done. Now, on the wholesale side, when I had deals die, I had cold called per month, done the contracts, worked with the title company, negotiated with the seller, dealt with the agent, fought with the buyers, all of that stuff, right? I had done 10 times more work, which means what? When the deal dies, it's 10 times more painful. So that's my plus and minus on con number 1. Now, con number 2 is a massive one, because con number 2 is that you can actually lose money. Now, whether you're funding these deals with your money or somebody else's money is beside the point, because you can lose money on these deals. And this is huge. If I'm comparing number 2 on our cons list here versus wholesaling for transactional funding, right? This con is worse than wholesaling. Why? Because in wholesaling, if you have a deal die, you lose the deal. But if you fund a deal and you mess up the contracts, there's a lawsuit, there's issues involved, something is done incorrectly, you can lose that money straight up. And I want to be as clear about that as possible. If I fund a $100,000 deal and on that deal, I mess something up, I'm not well prepared, whatever it might be, something happens that I didn't expect or didn't know how to handle, that money can just disappear. Gone. $100,000. It could go to the seller. It could go to the buyer. It could go to the title company. It could get into a lawsuit, but that money can disappear. And losing money is a massive, massive con. Now, how do I contradict that if I'm still running this business? Well, by learning how to do things correctly, by having proper contracts, by working with people that know what they're doing, by not assuming that I know more than I do. Those are all the ways that I protect my money. But that does not negate the fact that you can lose money. And if you can lose money, that's a pretty dang big con. Okay. Now, number 3 is something that you may have heard if you know about transactional funding. And that's the fact that transactional funding can be considered, quote, saturated. Why? Well, if I told you that you could go put $10,000 into something and make $1,000 in a month, aka get a 10% return, which is 10 times higher than you make in the stock market, would that be something that you're interested in? Probably, right? That's what got me into it at first. I was like, oh shoot, this is easy. Which, by the way, let's stop right there. If you ever think something is just going to be easy, you're probably thinking about it incorrectly, or you have been lied to by somebody, right? But the saturation, why is that? Well, first of all, because a lot of people are talking about this stuff. And if I talk about it, break it down in blue over here, there's 3 main things that I talk to you guys about. EMD, double close, and seller carrybacks. These are the 3 primary forms of transactional funding. EMD is usually low money. It's between 1 to 10K. What does that mean? It means that almost anybody can do it, or they can find somebody that can help them do it. So on a supply and demand scale, there's way more supply for getting this done. But these guys right here, they average $250,000. Now, does your average person have or know how to get access to $250,000 to safely fund a deal? Probably not. At least not on average, right? And so there's a huge difference between these 2 things. And everybody will look at these EMD deals and say, oh, well, it's saturated. Well, yeah, there's probably a lot of people trying to do that. And guess what? 2 things. Number 1, if you work on the things that less people know how to solve, you will make more money and you will have less competition. That's the first point. And the second point is that if a bunch of people are working on something, do you know how easy it is to be better than the average person when people don't really try that hard? You get on the phone, you make yourself available, you show that you have more knowledge, you work faster, you solve problems. If you can do that, I can tell you, I fund these kinds of deals all the time. There's people in my ear over here saying that things are saturated, and I'm over here saying I keep making money regardless. So which one of those really matters? Well, it's important to understand that that is a con of this. That if you just go into the open ocean and you're like, I'm hoping for this to be easy and I don't want to put in too much work and let's just see what happens, then you are going to end up as one of the people that suffers from those cons. And that's why you as a whole can avoid this con of saturation if you just learn how to be better and how to be the most problem-solving human being that you can be when you jump into this, regardless of how much money you have. Now, I'm going to go into a lot more detail when it comes to my story of how I got into real estate as a whole in this video right here, so you can click here to watch that next.